I'm George Murphy. I'm a retired Lutheran pastor. I served my last 9 years in an Episcopal parish too before I retired, so I have some ecumenical experience. Before I went into the ministry, I was in physics and got my doctorate in physics from Johns Hopkins, and as taught in colleges for about 12 years before I went to seminary. My interest in religion and science goes back pretty early because I was interested in science very early and also was quite active and interested in the church and interested in theology. So it was kind of hard for me to decide what to go into to start. I went into physics and gradually, as time went on, found myself getting more and more interested in the interface between science and theology, and finally decided that I needed to go to seminary to learn some more formal theology than what I had been reading, and have gotten very much involved in working on science and theology, specifically for the work of the church, for ministry. Because while the science-theology dialogue has grown considerably over the last 30 years, I mean, it's just really been an explosion of people working in this, conferences, books, organizations, and so forth. A great deal of that has been pretty much academic theology. Now, that's important, and you need that as a grounding for doing ministry. But if it's just going to remain at the level of academic theology, it's not going to do the job that the church needs it to do, which is to come out in Christian education in parishes, in preaching, in pastoral care, in the social action of the church. And so while I'm concerned with that kind of systematic theology dimension of it, that is, how do we make sense theologically of what we know about the world scientifically. I'm also very much interested in how do we make use of that in educational materials, how do we help people to preach in ways that address the questions that science and technology introduce. And the other things that I mentioned, the social action of the church and things like the environmental sciences, of course, have very much that dimension. A lot of pastoral care nowadays does with bioethical issues and things of that sort. Specifically in seminary, of course, you can just talk generally about science and religion or science and faith or science and theology. What was really very important thing in my seminary education was really getting an understanding of Luther's theology of the cross and realizing that's really the way to approach this science-theology dialogue and understanding the significance that the theology of the cross has for dealing with an issue like evolution, but more generally dealing with the whole question of how God acts in the world and how we know God. Do we actually learn about God from science, or what's the relationship between any knowledge of God that we may have from looking at the natural world and from God's revelation in Christ? And so that I have used ever since then for my own thinking, use that theology of the cross as a fundamental way of addressing or trying to address these issues. Another thing that I've been interested in recently is extending the science theology discussion beyond simply the doctrine of creation. Now, clearly that's very important, and I'm going to be talking about it later in the conference here, but most of the discussions that have been had have involved the question of how God acts in the world, the origin of the world, and that kind of thing. And the core of the gospel, of course, is not simply the doctrine of creation. It is new creation, if you wish. It's salvation. It's the work of Christ. in saving humanity and in saving really the whole creation. And so what I'm interested in now is extending the work that I've done previously in dealing with the doctrine of creation to talk about atonement in a way that makes some connection with the scientific picture of the world. Now, this does not mean we want to develop a scientific theory of the atonement, whatever that would be, but simply being able to talk about atonement in a way that, as I said, makes contact with the scientific picture of the world.